When my stepson asked me to watch a movie with him, I thought it would be an ordinary night. But what started as an innocent moment between us quickly unraveled into something I never could have anticipated. What happens when emotions blur the lines of right and wrong, and you're forced to confront desires that threaten to destroy everything you hold dear? Before we dive into this unforgettable story, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more captivating tales like this one. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one. It was a quiet Sunday evening, and the house was unusually still. My husband, Richard, was away on another one of his work trips, something that had become a routine over the years. I was in the kitchen, idly wiping the counters, trying to distract myself from the gnawing emptiness that had settled into my life. The monotony of our marriage was a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying until my stepson Jason entered my life. "Hey, Laura, you want to watch something with me? I downloaded that movie you mentioned last week," Jason's voice called from the living room. I looked up, surprised. Jason rarely initiated anything with me beyond polite small talk. Over the past few months, I had noticed subtle changes in him. At 20, he was no longer the awkward teenager who had once trailed behind his father. He had grown into himself. Broad shoulders, confident strides, and a quiet charm that made it hard not to notice him. His presence had a way of filling the room, and lately I had caught myself lingering on him a little too long, feeling a mix of guilt and something I couldn't quite name. "Sure," I called back, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just let me finish up here." As I joined him in the living room, I noticed how comfortable he looked, sprawled on the couch, his long legs taking up most of the space. He smiled as I approached, patting the seat beside him. "I saved you the best spot," he teased. I laughed, brushing off the warmth creeping into my cheeks, and sat down. The couch was large, but somehow it felt impossibly small with him there. The movie started, and I tried to focus on the screen, but my mind kept wandering. His proximity, the faint scent of his cologne, the way his arm casually rested on the back of the couch. It was all too distracting. About 30 minutes into the movie, I noticed Jason sneaking glances at me. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I turned my head just in time to catch his eyes darting away. My heart skipped a beat. "What?" I asked, feigning nonchalance. "Nothing," he said, smirking. "You just seem different tonight." "Dear friend, how?" I asked, my voice laced with curiosity and a bit of nervousness. "I don't know, relaxed, maybe?" His tone was light, but there was something deeper behind his words, something that made my stomach flutter. I laughed softly, shaking my head. "I think you're imagining things." He didn't reply, but his gaze lingered a second longer before turning back to the screen. I felt a strange tension building between us, an unspoken connection that neither of us acknowledged but both clearly felt. I tried to push it aside, to focus on the movie, but it was as if the air between us had shifted. The movie progressed, and I found myself sinking deeper into the cushions, my guard slowly lowering. Jason leaned forward to grab the remote, pausing the film for a bathroom break. As he moved, his arm brushed against mine, and I felt a jolt of electricity run through me. It was nothing, a harmless touch, but it left me rattled. When he returned, he sat a little closer than before. I told myself it was just the cramped couch, but the rationalization felt hollow. His leg pressed lightly against mine, and neither of us moved to create space. "You okay?" he asked, noticing my silence. "Yeah, I'm fine," I replied, though my voice betrayed me, trembling slightly. "Are you sure?" he pressed, his eyes searching mine. I nodded quickly, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess." He said, his tone unreadable. "Maybe you need to relax more. You're always so tense." The comment felt loaded, though I wasn't sure if it was intentional or just my overactive imagination. I decided to let it go, but my mind was racing. Was I reading too much into this? Or was there something real happening here? Something I didn't dare to confront? By the time the movie ended, the tension between us was palpable. Jason turned off the TV and stretched, his shirt riding up slightly to reveal a sliver of his toned stomach. I looked away quickly, ashamed at where my thoughts had wandered. "Thanks for watching with me," he said, his voice softer now, almost intimate. "I miss hanging out like this." "I'll see." "Me too," I admitted, surprised by my own honesty. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It felt like we were standing on the edge of something, both afraid to take the next step but unable to pull back. "Well," I said, breaking the silence, "I should probably head to bed." "Yeah, of course," he said, standing up as I did. "Good night, Laura." "Good night, Jason." As I turned to leave, I felt his eyes on me, and for a fleeting second I wondered what would happen if I turned around, if I let myself give in to the thoughts I'd been suppressing. But I didn't. Instead, I walked away, my heart pounding, and my mind racing with questions I wasn't ready to answer. I threw on a robe and headed downstairs. The house was unusually quiet, but as I entered the kitchen, I found Jason sitting at the counter, sipping coffee. His hair was slightly messy, and he looked relaxed in a plain t-shirt and sweatpants. He glanced up when he saw me, a smile playing on his lips. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied, suddenly hyper-aware of how disheveled I looked. "I made coffee," he offered, gesturing to the pot. "Figured you could use some." "Thanks." I poured myself a cup, grateful for the distraction. The room felt too small, the silence between us too loaded. I tried to focus on the steam rising from my mug, but I could feel his eyes on me. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked, after a moment. I lied. "You?" He shrugged. "Sort of." Kept thinking about last night. My heart skipped a beat. "The movie?" "Not exactly," he said, his tone casual but his eyes intense. He took a slow sip of his coffee, as if waiting for me to respond. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to find a way to steer the conversation back to safer ground, but he didn't give me the chance. "You seemed different last night," he continued, his voice softer now. "Like something was on your mind." "I think you're reading too much into it," I said quickly, my voice sharper than I intended. "It was just a movie, Jason." "Was it?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The way he looked at me, like he could see straight through my defenses, was both unnerving and thrilling. I felt like a deer caught in headlights, unable to move, unable to look away. I started, but the words wouldn't come. Jason stood up, setting his mug down on the counter. He was so close now that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "Laura," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded, though every instinct in me screamed to run, to escape whatever was about to happen. "Do you ever feel like—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Like there's something between us?" The air seemed to leave the room. I stared at him, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. Fear, desire, guilt. My silence was answer enough. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, stepping back. "I shouldn't have said that. Forget I—" "No," I interrupted, surprising even myself. "Don't apologize." His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment we just stood there, the silence between us deafening. I didn't know what I was doing, what I was saying. All I knew was that something had shifted, and there was no going back. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I avoided Jason as much as possible, retreating to the sanctuary of my bedroom under the pretense of catching up on work, but no amount of distractions could keep my thoughts at bay. His words replayed in my mind like a broken record, each repetition chipping away at my resolve. That evening, I found myself in the kitchen again, preparing dinner. The routine was soothing, almost meditative, and for a moment, I felt like I could breathe again. But then Jason walked in, and the fragile sense of normalcy I had built crumbled instantly. "Need any help?" he asked, his tone light, almost playful. "Fine," I said, keeping my focus on the chopping board. "Dinner will be ready soon." He leaned against the counter, watching me. I could feel his presence like a physical weight, and it took everything in me to keep my hands steady. "Laura," he said after a moment, "about this morning?" "Jason, please," I interrupted, turning to face him. "We can't do this." "Do what?" he asked, his voice low but steady. "Talk? Be honest about what we're feeling?" "There's nothing to talk about," I said, though even I didn't believe the words. "Then why are you shaking?" he asked, stepping closer. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. He was right, I was trembling, though whether it was from fear or something else I couldn't say. All I knew was that I was standing on the edge of a precipice, and Jason was pulling me closer to the edge. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice barely a whisper now. "And I will." I didn't. Instead, I stood there frozen as he closed the distance between us. His hand brushed against mine, and that small, simple touch sent a shiver down my spine. He leaned in, his breath warm against my skin, and for a moment, I forgot how to breathe. "Jason," I said, my voice trembling, "this is wrong." "And why does it feel so right?" he countered. I had no answer. All I knew was that I was caught in a storm I couldn't escape, and part of me didn't want to. Dinner that night was unbearable. Jason and I sat at the dining table, the clinking of utensils against plates the only sound breaking the heavy silence. I couldn't look at him, couldn't meet the gaze I could feel burning into me from across the table. My appetite was non-existent, but I forced myself to take small bites, hoping to appear normal. Jason, however, seemed unbothered. If anything, he looked amused, as though he found my discomfort entertaining. It was infuriating, but I couldn't summon the energy to confront him. I was too consumed by my own thoughts, my own guilt. After dinner, I retreated to the living room, hoping to lose myself in a book, but the words blurred together on the page, my mind refusing to focus. When Jason entered the room, I tensed, gripping the book tighter as if it could shield me from whatever was about to happen. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice casual. "It's your house too," I replied, keeping my eyes on the book. He chuckled softly, the sound both irritating and alluring. He sat on the other end of the couch, leaving just enough space between us to make me feel on edge. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, but not unbearable. It was as if we were both waiting for the other to make the first move. "You've been avoiding me," Jason said finally. I glanced up, startled by his directness. "I have not," I said, though the words lacked conviction. "Yes, you have," he said, leaning back against the couch. "And I get it. I made things weird this morning. I don't know, I couldn't keep it to myself anymore." "Jason, stop," I said, my voice firmer now. "We can't have this conversation." "Why not?" he asked, his tone soft but insistent. "Why can't we talk about what's happening?" "Because nothing is happening," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. "You're my stepson. Whatever you're feeling, it's not real, isn't it?" he asked, his eyes locking onto mine. "Because it feels real to me." I looked away, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but I couldn't, because the truth was, it felt real to me too. The next few days passed in a blur. Jason seemed to respect my need for space, keeping his distance but never far enough that I could truly escape him. I found myself hyper-aware of his every move, every glance, every casual touch. It was maddening, but I couldn't bring myself to confront him again. I didn't trust myself to say the right thing. One evening, As I was folding laundry in the bedroom, there was a soft knock at the door. I froze, my hand stilling over a towel. "Come in," I said, though my voice was barely above a whisper. Jason stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "I just wanted to check on you," he said. "I'm fine," I replied, avoiding his gaze. "Just busy." He nodded, leaning against the door frame. "You've been busy a lot lately." "Is that a problem?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. "No problem," he said, his lips twitching into a small smile. "Just an observation." I sighed, setting the towel aside. "What do you want, Jason?" He hesitated, his gaze flickering to the floor before meeting mine again. I don't want things to be weird between us." "They're not weird," I lied. He raised an eyebrow. "You're a terrible liar." I couldn't help but laugh, though the sound was more bitter than amused. "Fine, things are weird, but they don't have to be. We can just move on." "Can we?" he asked, stepping closer. "Because I don't think I can." "Jason," I warned, but he didn't stop. He was standing in front of me now, so close I could feel the heat radiating from him. "Tell me you don't feel it too," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me, and I'll walk away." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. The truth hung heavy in the air between us, unspoken but undeniable. I hated myself for it, for the way my body reacted to his proximity, for the way my heart raced at his words. But most of all, I hated that I couldn't lie to him. "I can't do this," I said finally, my voice trembling. "This is wrong." "Oh," he asked, his tone insistent. "Because of some stupid label? You're not my mom, Laura. You've never been my mom." "It doesn't make it okay," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "This will destroy everything." "Only if we let it," he said, his hand reaching up to brush a tear from my cheek. "It doesn't have to be like that." His touch was gentle, his eyes full of an intensity that made my heart ache. For a moment, I let myself believe him. I let myself imagine a world where this could work, where we could be together without consequence. But reality crashed down around me like a tidal wave. "I can't," I said, pulling away. "I won't." Jason looked at me for a long moment, his expression a mix of hurt and understanding. "Okay," he said finally, his voice soft. "I'll give you space. But just know, I'm not giving up." He left the room, closing the door quietly behind him. I sank onto the bed, my body trembling as the weight of my emotions crashed over me. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to fix the mess I had found myself in. All I knew was that things could never go back to the way they were. Over the next week, I buried myself in household chores, anything to keep myself busy and distracted. Jason seemed to honor his promise to give me space, though his absence felt just as suffocating as his presence had before. I told myself this was for the best, that keeping my distance was the right thing to do, but late at night when the house was quiet and my thoughts refused to settle, I couldn't stop replaying our conversations, his words, his touch. One afternoon, while I was folding laundry in the living room, I heard Jason come in through the front door. I stiffened, my hands faltering over a t-shirt. He hadn't been around much the past few days, and I had convinced myself that maybe he had moved on, that maybe we could both pretend nothing had happened. But as he entered the room, his presence seemed to fill every corner, and my pulse quickened. "Hey," he said, his tone casual as he dropped his bag by the door. "How's it going?" "Fine," I replied, not looking up. "Just catching up on laundry." He nodded, standing there awkwardly for a moment before sitting down on the couch opposite me. I kept my eyes fixed on the pile of clothes in front of me, determined not to let my resolve waver, but I could feel his gaze on me, heavy and unrelenting. "Wow," he said, finally breaking the silence. "Can we talk?" I shook my head, my voice firm. "There's nothing to talk about, Jason." Yes, there is, he insisted, leaning forward. I know you feel it too, and I don't understand why you're fighting so hard against it. Because it's wrong, I snapped, finally looking up at him. You're my stepson, Jason. Whatever this is, it can't happen. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. You keep saying that, but you're not really explaining why. You're not my mom. You're not even really my parent. You're just Laura. Just Laura, I repeated, my voice breaking. Do you have any idea how much damage this could do? To your dad, to this family, to us? I'm not worried about Dad, he said, his tone almost defiant. He's never here, Laura. You're the one who's been here for me, who's cared about me, not him. And yet, that doesn't make this okay, I said, tears stinging my eyes. I can't be the person who destroys your relationship with your father. Jason stood up, his frustration evident in the way he ran his hands through his hair again. You're not listening to me. He's not here. He doesn't care, and maybe you don't want to admit it, but you're not happy with him either. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, because deep down I knew they were true. My marriage to Richard had been crumbling for years, the cracks widening with every business trip, every night spent alone. But admitting that, even to myself, felt like crossing a line I wasn't ready to face. I don't know what you want me to say, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I don't want you to say anything, he said, his voice softening. I just want you to be honest with yourself. With me. He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. For a moment I thought he was going to touch me, to close the distance between us, but he stopped himself, his hands curling into fists at his sides. I'll back off, he said finally, if that's what you really want. But if you can look me in the eye and tell me you don't feel anything for me, I'll walk away. I opened my mouth, ready to tell him exactly what he wanted to hear, but the words wouldn't come. My silence was answer enough. Jason sighed, his shoulders slumping. That's what I thought. He turned and left the room, and I collapsed onto the couch, my body shaking as the tears finally came. I didn't know how to move forward, didn't know how to reconcile the war raging inside me. All I knew was that I was standing on the edge of a precipice, and the ground beneath me was crumbling. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard a soft knock on my door. My heart leapt into my throat, and for a moment I considered pretending I was asleep. But something compelled me to answer. Come in, I said, my voice trembling. The door creaked open, and Jason stepped inside. He looked hesitant, unsure, and it was the first time I'd seen him look vulnerable. He closed the door behind him, leaning against it as if to steady himself. I couldn't sleep, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I sat up, pulling the blanket tighter around me. Jason, this isn't a good idea. I know, he said, his eyes meeting mine, but I needed to see you. The room was silent except for the sound of our breathing. He took a step closer, and then another, until he was standing at the foot of the bed. My heart was racing, my mind screaming at me to stop this, to send him away, but I couldn't move. Tell me to leave, he said, his voice raw. And I will. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Instead, I just stared at him, the conflict in my eyes betraying me. He took another step forward, and then another, until he was sitting on the edge of the bed. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through me. Jason, I whispered, my voice breaking, this can't happen. Then stop me, he said, his eyes locked onto mine. If you really want me to stop, just say the word. But I didn't, I couldn't, and in that moment I knew there was no turning back. Jason's hand lingered on mine, the warmth of his touch spreading through me like wildfire. I should have pulled away, should have told him to leave, but my body betrayed me. Every fiber of my being screamed for something I couldn't allow myself to have. "Jason, you need to leave," I whispered, my voice trembling, but even as I said it, I didn't move. "Do you really want me to?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. There was a vulnerability in his gaze that disarmed me, a raw honesty that made it impossible to lie. I swallowed hard, unable to speak. He shifted closer, his knee brushing against mine, and my breath hitched. The room felt impossibly small, the air between us charged with unspoken tension. "Laura," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "I can't stop thinking about you, about us. I want—" "There is no us," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "This isn't right." "Maybe not," he admitted, "but it feels right, doesn't it?" I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. The truth was written all over my face, and he knew it. His hand moved to my cheek, his touch gentle, almost hesitant. I closed my eyes, torn between the overwhelming desire to lean into him and the crushing guilt that threatened to consume me. "This will destroy everything," I said, my voice cracking. "Your father—" "My father doesn't care," he interrupted, his tone firm. "He doesn't care about me. He doesn't care about you. He's barely here, Laura. He's not the one sitting here with you now." "That doesn't make this okay," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "It doesn't change what we're doing." He brushed a tear from my cheek, his thumb lingering on my skin. "Maybe not, but it doesn't change how I feel either." Before I could respond, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine. It was soft, tentative, as though he was giving me one last chance to stop him, but I didn't. I couldn't. And when his lips pressed more firmly against mine, I found myself kissing him back, the weight of my guilt momentarily forgotten. The kiss deepened, and I felt myself melting into him, my hands clutching at his shirt as if he were the only thing anchoring me to reality. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and for a moment, all the reasons why this was wrong faded into the background. All that mattered was the way he made me feel, alive, wanted, understood. But the moment was fleeting. Reality crashed down around me like a tidal wave, and I pulled back, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. "We can't," I said, my voice shaking. "Jason, we can't do this." "Why not?" he asked, his forehead resting against mine. "Tell me why and I'll stop." "Because it's wrong," I said, tears streaming down my face. "Because it'll ruin everything." He cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away my tears. "The only thing ruining this is the way you're torturing yourself over it. We're not hurting anyone, Laura. We're just—" I shook my head, pulling away from him. "You don't understand. This isn't just about us. There's too much at stake." He sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I don't know what else to say to convince you." "You don't have to convince me," I said, my voice firm despite the tears. "You just have to let me go." His eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I thought he was going to argue. But then he nodded, standing up and running a hand through his hair. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll give you space. But this isn't over." With that, he turned and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. I collapsed onto the bed, my body trembling as the weight of what had just happened settled over me. I didn't know how to move forward, didn't know how to face Jason or myself. All I knew was that things could never go back to the way they were. The days that followed were excruciating. Jason and I barely spoke, the tension between us palpable. I avoided him as much as possible, throwing myself into errands and chores in a desperate attempt to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the memory of that kiss, the way it had made me feel. Late one night, as I was sitting in the living room with a glass of wine, I heard Jason's footsteps on the stairs. I tensed, bracing myself for another confrontation, but he didn't come into the room. Instead, he paused at the bottom of the stairs. "Can we talk?" he asked finally, his voice soft. I sighed, setting my glass down on the coffee table. "Jason, I don't think there's anything left to say." "Maybe not," he said, stepping into the room, "but I need to say it anyway." I looked at him, my heart aching at the pain in his eyes. "Okay," I said, "talk." He sat down across from me, his hands clasped tightly together. "I know I've made things difficult for you, and I know this whole situation is complicated. But I don't regret what happened, not for a second." "Jason," I started, but he held up a hand to stop me. "Just let me finish," he said. "I don't expect you to feel the same way, and I don't expect you to do anything you're not comfortable with. But I need you to know that I care about you, more than I probably should." Tears welled in my eyes, and I looked away, unable to face him. "You're making this harder than it already is." "I know," he said, his voice cracking, "and I'm sorry. But I can't pretend like none of this happened. I can't pretend like I don't feel the way I do." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the things we couldn't say. Finally, Jason stood up, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I'll give you space," he said. "But just know that I'm not going anywhere. I'm here when you're ready." With that, he walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway, the sound of his words echoing in my mind. One evening, as I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, I heard Jason's voice behind me. "Sarah," he said softly, and I froze. I didn't turn around, afraid of what I might see in his eyes. "Jason, I don't think we should—" "Please," he interrupted, his voice heavy with emotion. "Just hear me out." I sighed, setting the dish down and gripping the edge of the sink for support. "I don't know if I can, Jason. This is hard enough as it is." "I know," he said, stepping closer. I could feel his presence just behind me, the warmth of him unsettling yet comforting. "But avoiding it isn't making it any easier." I turned to face him, my heart pounding in my chest. His expression was raw, his eyes pleading. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Honesty," he said simply. "I need to know how you feel. Not what you think is right or wrong, just how you feel." I stared at him, my defenses crumbling under the weight of his gaze. "I don't know," I admitted, tears spilling down my cheeks. "I'm so confused, Jason. I feel things I shouldn't, and it's tearing me apart." He stepped closer, his hands hovering near mine but not quite touching. "It's tearing me apart too," he said softly, "but I can't help how I feel. And I don't think you can either." "Jason, this is dangerous," I said, my voice trembling. "If anyone finds out—" "They won't," he said firmly. "I won't let that happen." "But what about your father? What about us?" I asked, the weight of my guilt threatening to overwhelm me. "My father hasn't cared about this family in years," he said, his voice filled with frustration. "You and I both know that. And as for us, I don't know. I just know I can't pretend this doesn't exist anymore." I closed my eyes, taking a shaky breath. When I opened them, he was still there, his gaze unwavering. "Jason, I'm scared," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "So am I," he said, his hand finally closing over mine. "But I'm more scared of losing you." The weeks after Jason's return were an exercise in restraint. We both seemed determined to rebuild some semblance of normalcy, carefully navigating around the tension that simmered beneath the surface. He threw himself into his studies and job applications, while I focused on home projects and filling the house with distractions. On the surface, everything appeared fine, but late at night, when I caught him watching me from across the room, or when our hands brushed during the simplest interactions, the truth was inescapable. We were still tethered by an unspoken connection that refused to fade. One evening, Richard returned home early from one of his business trips. His arrival was unexpected, catching me mid-dinner preparation. He walked into the kitchen, his face brightened by an easy smile. "Smells good in here," he said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. I forced a smile, the guilt curling in my stomach like a coiled snake. Jason appeared a moment later, pausing in the doorway when he saw his father. I noticed the flicker of tension in his jaw before he stepped inside. "Hey, Dad," Jason said, his tone even but distant. "Jason," Richard exclaimed, slapping him on the shoulder. "Good to see you, son. You've been keeping an eye on your stepmom while I've been away, right?" Jason's gaze flickered to me for the briefest moment before he nodded. "Yeah, we've been fine." Rashid's obliviousness to the tension between us was almost laughable. He continued talking about his trip and the new deals he'd closed while Jason and I exchanged careful glances, neither of us saying much. Dinner was a strained affair, the unspoken weight between Jason and me almost palpable. Richard, of course, noticed nothing. That night, after Richard had gone to bed, I stayed up late cleaning the kitchen. It was a futile attempt to distract myself from the storm raging inside me. When I finally turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I found Jason sitting on the floor outside my bedroom door. My breath caught as our eyes met, and he stood, running a hand through his hair. "I needed to see you," he said, his voice low. "Jason, you can't be here," I whispered, glancing down the hall toward Richard's room. "I know," he said, stepping closer, "but I can't keep pretending everything is fine. It's not." "Jason, please," I said, my voice trembling. "Your father is here. If he sees us—" "I don't care," he interrupted, his voice fierce but quiet. "I can't do this anymore, Laura. I can't keep pretending like I don't feel what I feel." I pressed my back against the door, my heart racing. "You have to stop," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "We have to stop." "I've tried," he said, his eyes blazing with emotion. "But every time I see you, every time I hear your voice, I can't stop thinking about you." His words sent a jolt through me, and I felt my resolve crumbling. "Jason, this is dangerous. We can't keep doing this. It'll destroy everything." "I don't care," he said, stepping closer. "You're the only thing that feels real to me, Laura. You're the only one who's ever understood me." Tears welled in my eyes as I shook my head. "You have to go," I whispered. "Please." He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine before he finally nodded. "Okay," he said quietly, "but this isn't over." That evening, after Richard had left, Jason and I found ourselves in the living room. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel his eyes on me as I pretended to read a book. Finally, he spoke. "Laura," he said softly, "we need to talk." I closed the book, setting it on the table. "Jason, I don't think there's anything left to say." "There is," he insisted, leaning forward. "I know you're scared. I am too. But that doesn't change how I feel about you." "I'm not asking you to justify it," he said. "I'm just asking you to be honest. With yourself, with me." I swallowed hard, tears spilling down my cheeks. "I don't know what to do, Jason. I don't know how to fix this." "Maybe it doesn't need fixing," he said, his voice soft. "Maybe we just need to figure out how to live with it." I shook my head, my chest tightening. "I don't think I can." "You can," he said, his hand brushing against mine. "We can. Together." The next morning, Jason came into the kitchen while I was making coffee. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed, but his expression was calm. "I've decided to leave," he said quietly. My heart sank. "What?" "I think it's the only way," he said, his voice steady but filled with sadness. "For both of us." "Jason, you don't have to do this," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "We can figure this out. We can—" "No, we can't," he said, cutting me off gently. This isn't going to go away, Laura. And if I stay, it's only going to get harder. I nodded, my throat tightening. Where will you go? Back to Mom's for a while, he said. Maybe travel. I need to get away. And I think you do too. I wanted to argue, to beg him to stay, but I knew he was right. When? I asked, my voice breaking. Tomorrow, he said. I've already packed. I'll miss you, I whispered. I'll miss you too, he said, his voice cracking. More than you'll ever know. The next day, I stood on the porch as Jason loaded his bags into his car. He turned to me one last time, his eyes filled with pain and something else. Goodbye, Laura, he said softly. Goodbye, Jason, I said, tears streaming down my face. As he drove away, I felt a mix of heartbreak and relief. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time I felt a glimmer of clarity. This wasn't the end, it was a new beginning. For both of us.